In this video, we're going to take a look at brushes and painting to add hard surface details. I'm going to be working on the body texture set, and I'm going to create a new paintable layer here in the layer stack. I can do that by clicking the paintbrush icon, and you can see here that I've created a paintable layer, and I'm going to place this here directly below the dirt. Now for this layer, I'm going to call this hard surface. Now, because I have a paintable layer, you can see that I have my brush icon and I can now paint directly on this 3D model. Now, before we jump right into creating the hard surface details, I want to talk just a little bit about the brush system here in Substance Painter. So if I right click, you can see here that I get this properties panel, and this is going to be the same properties panel that we see docked here. Now, the brush system is going to be comprised of a stroke and a material. Now, if we take a look at the stroke, you can see here that we have several parameters, things like size, flow, stroke opacity, angle, as well as some controls for jittering some of the parameters such as size and position. Now, if we look over here at the Substance Painter shelf, we have this brushes category, and we have all these brushes here, and these are essentially a preset for configuring the brush parameters. So for example, if I come over here to Dirt 2, and I just left click here, I can enable this parameter. Now you'll notice that my size and my angle jitter have changed, and also some of the other brush properties have been changed to match this dirt preset. Here in the preview window, I can actually start to paint a stroke so that I can preview what these parameters are going to look like. Now, this particular preset is also using what's called an alpha. An alpha is a grayscale texture that allows me to customize the tip of the brush. So in this case, you can see that I'm using the Dirt 02 Alpha to create this dirt effect. Now here in the shelf, if I come over here to my alphas, you can see that we ship with all kinds of these different alpha textures that we can use to create customized brushes. So for example, if I grab this brush smudge, I can left click and just drag and drop that here to the alpha to create just a different effect. So here you can see I'm getting a different brush. Now we have this set up. If I come over here to my 3D view and I start to paint, you can see that I'm actually starting to paint with this information. And like I said, I'm painting directly on the 3D model. So I'll hit Control Z to undo that. And let me right click once more to get back to my brush settings. Now here we also have this material. Now material is the other counterpart to creating a brush here in Substance Painter. And here you can see all of the channels of my texture set here are enabled by default. And I can enable and disable these channels as I need them. So in this case, if I jump back over here to my shelf once again, I go to material presets, and let's just use this brass preset. So I'll just left click here. You can see that loads up a preset here for the material, just configuring some of the attributes such as my base color, roughness, and metal. Now, if I go back here to my 3D view and I start to paint, you can see that I'm painting with that modified brush and alpha channel as well as this material preset. And this allows me here to create, well, my overall brush system that I'm going to be using. So again, if I right click here, and let's say that I like this particular combination, I can right click once more in the actual properties panel to either create a material preset from this or create a brush preset or create a tool, which is a combination of both the brush and the material. For example, the brush preset is going to represent the parameters for the brush as well as the alpha. A material is just the parameters for the material, and a tool is going to be the brush as well as the material combined together. All right, so let me go back. I'm just going to undo this here. And now we can get into actually setting up the brush that we're going to use to paint these hard surface details. So to start, I'm going to come over here to my brushes, and I'm just going to start with this basic soft brush just to get me to a default state. And now I need to edit the material. So here in the properties, I'm just going to come over here to the actual material. And I just want to enable my normal channel. So a quick way to do this is to hold down the Alt key and then just left click on a channel, and you can see that that quickly disables all of the other channels, and now we have just our normal information. And so what I'm going to do is come over here to the hard surfaces section of the shelf. Here we have many of these normal textures that we can use to quickly apply or create hard surface details on our model. So in the search, I'm just going to type in vent. And then I'm going to use this second option, which is this vent capsule horizontal. So I can just left click and drag and drop that here to the normal channel input. Now, just as a reminder, we can always just use the mini shelf and search for the texture that we want. So with this applied, you can see that the material preview gives me a good idea of what this is going to look like as I paint this here on the model. Now, the next thing we want to take a look at is some of our brush properties. So you can see here that the size is pretty small. Now, we can adjust the size by just using the slider. However, a more convenient way of doing this is using a keyboard shortcut. So if I hold down the control key and use my right mouse button and move left to right, you can see that I can interactively control the size of my brush. Now, to adjust the rotation, I can hold down the control key and just left click and drag up and down, and this will adjust the angle as you see here in the properties panel. So we can do some adjustments like this. Now, one thing that you'll notice here with this particular stamp is that we have a bit of a fall off towards the top and the bottom. And this is an effect that I don't want. And so this is being caused by the alpha. So you can see because I used the brush and I used that basic soft, I have this soft alpha shape. In this case, I want to use the hard surface shape. So what I can do in this particular case is simply just remove the alpha. Remember, you can think of the alpha as the tip of the brush. Well, in my case, I want to paint with this very specific texture. So what I'm going to do is just come over to the alpha and click this X button to just delete it. So now you can see that I'll be working with the full texture. The top of the bottom of the brush is not going to be faded. Now, if I just simply do a left click, you can see that I can actually paint this value. However, I have one more small issue. I'm using a Wacom pen, and so this is actually using my pressure sensitivity. I'll hit Control Z to undo that stroke. I'll jump back over to my brush properties, and here I can disable pen pressure. So I'm just going to turn that off in this case because I want to actually use this as a full stamp. I want to use the entire texture. Now I'll just stamp this texture onto the 3D mesh, and now you can see that we have this nice hard surface detail. All right, so now in this case, I'm gonna hit Control Z, and I'm going to restamp this asset. So I'm gonna scale my brush down and then do a rotation. And what I would like to do is add this shape here symmetrical on the 3D mesh. So to do that, I can rely on the symmetry option. So up here at the top of the 3D view, you can click this button, which is the symmetry button to enable symmetry. And here you can see that we have this red line, which indicates the line of symmetry. Now you'll notice that as I move my brush here over in this section, we have this little red dot, which indicates the symmetrized version of this stroke. Now here at the top of the toolbar, I can take a look at the symmetry options. You'll notice here that I have the Mirror X enabled, which is what I want. Now this asset was modeled at the origin. Or if I'm working with an asymmetrical model, I can enable the manipulator. The manipulator allows me to change the axis of symmetry. So for example, here you can see that if this model were offset, I can just simply adjust the symmetry line to compensate. Now here in this case, like I said, I know this is already at the 0 origin, so I'm just going to numerically set this back here to 0. I'm also going to come over here and disable the manipulator, and now I will come in and just place the stroke. So you can see that I'm just lining up my brush size and rotation, and now I'll just left click, and now we've added this hard surface detail here in this mid section. So now let's start adding some additional details. So I'm going to come over here to the hard surfaces, and in this case, I'm going to do a search here for edge. So I'll start to type in edge, and I'm going to use this edge 02. So once again, I will right click. I want to come over here to the material setting because we are using this normal texture. So I'm going to drag and drop this here to the normal input. And I already have my symmetry enabled, so I'm going to leave that to the same settings. And then I'm just going to rotate here the brush, and then I'm going to just scale it down and reposition it. And I'm just going to stamp this right into this location. Now I'm going to do the same thing right below. I just need to rotate the brush. Again, I'm using the control key, left mouse button up and down to quickly rotate. And then I will stamp this detail right below in this location. Okay, so we've added some additional detail. Now I'm going to jump back over here to my shelf. And in this case, I'm going to do a search for Vent 07, and I'm going to use this normal texture. So I'll right click once more, drag and drop Vent 07 into the normal channel input. Now what I'm going to do is just focus here at this area towards the bottom. I'm going to rotate the brush to get it into position, adjust my scale and position so I have this stroke right where I want it, and then I'll place the detail here. So because of symmetry, you can see that it's actually updating on both sides of the model. Let's rotate around here towards the back. And once again, I'm just going to reposition the rotation and scale of my brush, and then I'll stamp this detail here in place. Let's take a look at the other side, and you can see because of symmetry, it's been updated. Okay, so we have that working. Now I am going to also use this same detail. I'm actually going to place that here. So let me just rescale the brush. So again, I'm just using Control or right mouse button left to right to adjust the size of the brush. And then I'll just left click to stamp in that detail. Now I'm going to use this particular detail one last time. I'll just rotate my brush, get this into position with my scale and rotation, and then just stamp in this detail here. Okay, so you can see with just a few quick operations, we've now added some additional hard surface details. All right, so now what I would like to do is add maybe a panel here towards the top. So what I'm gonna do is come over here to the shelf once again. Let's just clear out our filter, and I'm gonna do a search for circle. And here you can see that we have this bevel circle. I'm gonna use this. So I'm gonna right click, left click, drag and drop, and let's place this normal texture here into the normal channel input. Now, these textures that I'm working with are also procedural. So we do have some parameters. In this case, we have the parameter here for our bevel thickness. And I am going to make a change to this. So I'll type in 0.05 and hit enter. And so now I've just changed that position. Okay, so in this case, I don't want to use the symmetry option. So I can come up here towards the top of my 3D view, and I'll just disable the symmetry. Okay, so I want to place this circle as a panel here towards the top. So an easy way to work with this is to hold down my Alt key and left click, I can orbit. But if I now hold down the Shift key, I can snap to a view. So now you can see that I'm looking at this from the top down. Here I'm going to hold down my Control key, right mouse button, and move towards the right to scale up this normal texture here that I'm going to stamp. And you can see I just line this up. This is going to represent kind of this circular panel at the top. And then I'll just left click to stamp that in place. And so now we have that circular panel, and that gives us a nice little detail. Now let's add a panel line. So in this case, I'm just going to come over here to my shelf, and I'll do a search for line, and I'm going to use this bevel line. So it's really good for adding these panel lines. So we'll right click once again. We're going to be focusing here on the material, of course. Left click, drag and drop the texture to the normal channel. Here we have some procedural parameters we can work with. I do want to change this bevel thickness, so I'll type in 0.05 and hit enter. Okay, and so now what I can do is just simply scale and rotate the brush into position, and then just simply stamp down this detail. So you can see I'm just lining this up and then just left click to stamp down this detail. Substance Painter is actually painting in true 3D space. So you'll notice that as I start to move my brush, the tip of the brush will align itself to the tangent of the mesh. This allows me to paint in 3D space without worrying about the texture being smeared through just basic camera projection. And that's why I can paint details like this without getting any kind of distortion here in my 3D view. We can also paint in the 2D view, and sometimes that gives us a better option. So here I'm going to hit Ctrl-Z to undo that. And then here at the top of my toolbar, I'm going to come over to this option that allows me to split my 3D and 2D view. You can see I have F1 as the shortcut. And so now I can take a look at the actual 2D view, and I can navigate this view very similar to how I would navigate with my 3D view. Holding down the Alt key and my middle mouse, I can pan, Alt, right mouse button, and I can zoom in. And in this case, I want to be able to place this panel line right here. So I'm just going to rotate my brush, scale it up a bit. And you can see here I can get maybe just a little bit of an easier view on how I want to place this panel line. So now I'll just left click, and here we get the result. So now we get a really nice panel line. Well, actually, this is a bit off center, so let me just reposition this panel line. So now I'll take this view back to just my 3D only. And just with a few simple steps, we've added a lot of extra hard surface detailing to our model without actually having to model this in our 3D application. We can do this non-destructively right here in Substance Painter. So next, I'm going to add some screws. I'll come over here to my shelf, and let's do a search for screw hex round. And I'm going to use this texture. So I'll right click to access my material. Let's left click and drag and drop this screw here. In this case, I'm going to use symmetry once again. So let me come over here to the top of my toolbar and enable symmetry. And then here I'm just going to scale the brush down and then just stamp in some of these details. It's really nice to use these hard surface textures here in Painter to quickly add details as part of the design phase. Now in this section for this circular panel, I'm going to use a symmetry mode called radial symmetry. So if I come over here to my symmetry options, you can see that I can enable radial symmetry. And now I need to choose an axis, so I'm going to choose the mirror y-axis. Here, this little dot indicates the origin for my radial symmetry. I can then also enable to show the axis, and here we can see the origin as well as the symmetrical instances here for this bolt. So what I'm going to do is jump back into my symmetry option, and I'm going to switch this count to 4. And now I can simply just position my original brush, and you can see here that because we're using radial symmetry, we will get instances of the stroke aligning around this circular panel. I will place my bolt here, and the radial symmetry updates the other 3 instances. Now we have several hard surface details added to our model to add more complexity. Now I'd like to further enhance these details by adding a bit more depth and volume, and I can do that by adding an ambient occlusion filter. So first we need to add a custom ambient occlusion channel to our texture set. So again, I have my body texture set selected. I'm going to come over to the texture set settings. If we take a look, we have our base channels, and these are the core channels that we have been working with throughout this course. Now I can add an additional channel by coming over here and clicking this plus button. Here you can see that at the very top, I have ambient occlusion. It's being a little cut off here in the screen recording. So I'm going to just left click to add this channel. So here you can see that we have a new ambient occlusion channel that we can work with. Now, if I jump over here to my layers, anytime we work with a layer or a fill layer, so for example, if I select my layer, I'm going to right click, you can see with my material, I now have the capability to work with ambient occlusion data. Now, what we're going to do is come over here to our shelf, and I'm going to drop into the filters. And we have a filter which is located here, and this is a Material FX filter for creating horizon-based ambient occlusion. This is a very high quality ambient occlusion result. And what this is going to do is provide some depth and shadowing into the corners of the hard surface detail. And like I said, this is going to bring out a bit more volume to these details. So to apply this filter, I can just left click and just drag and drop it here into the layer stack. Now, another way to work with this would be to have the layer selected. I can come over here to add effect, and I can choose to add a filter. Now you can see that I've applied a filter to the layer itself. Here in the properties, if I click the filter button, I can then search for that horizon-based ambient occlusion filter. So I'll left click here to apply it. Now, if we take a look at the properties, you can see here that there is a channel source, and it is set to height by default. Now, in our case, we have been creating these details on the normal channel. We've been using here, if we come over to our hard surfaces, we've been using these normal map textures to create these hard surface details authored in the normal channel. So we just simply need to set our channel source here to normal. And when I do that, you can see that we already start to get some of this shadowing. So here's what it looks like with the ambient occlusion effect turned off, and here's what it looks like with it turned on. And you can see that it is a subtle effect, but it does provide, like I said, a bit more depth and volume here to these hard surfaces that we've been creating. What's really cool about adding a filter to a layer, such as our paintable hard surface layers, is that anytime I go into the layer, and let's say that I just grab a completely different detail, like I'll just grab one here, and then I'll come over and I just stamp this detail down, that ambient occlusion is being generated for me automatically. So once again, if I come over and disable the effect, here's what we had before, and here's what we have after. Like I said, subtle, but it gives us that little bit of extra depth that we're looking for. So I'm just going to undo that final stroke there. And if we come back to the filter, we have options for increasing things like the height depth. So you can see here that we can actually basically intensify the overall effect. We can adjust the radius. So if we want to just tighten that up a little, we can do that by just adjusting the height depth and the radius. And then we also have a blur intensity. So that is going to conclude this video. Take some time to explore the hard surfaces, maybe add some new additional details here to your mesh. And when you're ready, join me in the next video.